of the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies and has been director of the International Buddhist Christian Theological Encounter. His work in interreligious dialogue for the Catholic Church includes being advisor on and participant in Buddhist Christian dialogue for the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. He's authored a number of books, including Green Monasticism, a Buddhist Catholic response to an environmental calamity. This is a terrific book, and I strongly encourage reviewing it. We're also privileged to have Liam Heneghan, who is professor of environmental science and co-director of DePaul's Institute for Nature and Culture. He's an ecosystem ecologist and has done extensive research, including studies on the impact of acid rain on soil food webs in Europe and on interbiome comparisons of decomposition and nutrient dynamics in forested ecosystems in North America and the tropics. Over the past decade, Liam and his students have been working on restoration issues in Midwestern ecosystems. He is also a philosopher and occasional poet, we wanted to note from his biography. And David Wellman, to my right, is Associate Professor in Religious Studies and co-director for the Center for Interreligious Engagement at DePaul. He holds a BA in International Affairs from Lewis and Clark College, an MA in Religion from Columbia University, and an MDiv and PhD in Christian Social Ethics from Union Theological Seminary in New York. Wellman's work focuses on the relationship between religion and diplomacy, ecological ethics, and interreligious engagement. So it's my pleasure to have Don Mitchell, Liam Heneghan, and David Wellman here to discuss this very timely topic that I, for one, believe does not receive enough attention in our discourse. So with that, I will turn it over to Don Mitchell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been to DePaul a number of times, last 20 years or so, and I always enjoy the programs that I participate in when I come up here, so, and the students as well. So I'm getting a message. You want me to speak louder? Microphone closer. Okay. All right. Now I understand. Thank you. So I was involved in 3 of the Gethsemane encounters, and since this is a program this week on World Catholicism, I thought I'd give a little background on these encounters in light of the world impact that those Catholic encounters had. And it's something that I don't think that many people know.
Based on the Second Vatican Council's document, Nostra Aetate, the Vatican Secretariat was founded in 1964 to promote the Catholic Church's relationship with other religions. In 1968, an organization was established to build intermonastic dialogue between the East and the West. Its first conference was held in Bangkok. This was the conference that Thomas Merton attended and then died tragically shortly after giving his presentation. The second conference was held in Bangalore, and the success of these 2
intermonastic conferences led the president of the Vatican Secretariat, now called the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, to write to the Benedictine abbot, a primate at that time, our own Rempert Weekland, requesting that Christian monks and nuns be invited to become a bridge and contact point for the Catholic Church's relationship with other religions around the world. interreligious in the United States, Monastic Interreligious Dialogue, or MID, was founded in 1978. And they began what were called the intermonastic hospitality exchanges between American Catholic and Tibetan Buddhist monastics, with the support of the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was a friend of Thomas Merton, so he was very happy to reestablish this relationship with
Catholic monasticism through MID. These exchanges continued for
10 years, up until 1992, and they've also continued after, but in a little different format, more in terms of helping Tibetan monks develop skills in computer science and health education, things like that, that are helpful to their communities. But in 1993, MID hosted a Buddhist-Christian dialogue on kenosis, or self-emptying, at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, here in Chicago, the Palmer House. The Dalai Lama participated in the Parliament dialogue and later suggested that there be a full week of shared practice and dialogue on the spiritual life at the Abbey of Gethsemani, since that was the home of his friend Thomas Merton. What resulted from this request was the first Gethsemani encounter in 1996. The four themes that we addressed at that encounter were prayer meditation, stages in the spiritual life, the role of the teacher and the community in spirituality, and the goals of personal and social transformation. Also, the encounter expanded beyond just Tibetan Buddhists to include Theravadan Buddhists from Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and the United States, as well as Zen Buddhists from Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the United States. So you can see how it developed from a rather simple set of exchanges into really a global dialogue with Buddhism. At the end of the encounter, a decision was made to hold a second Gethsemani encounter that would focus on the kinds of suffering people are experiencing today and ways of transforming that suffering through spiritual practice. And that was held in 2002. It addressed four topics: emotional suffering and healing, consumerism and freedom from attachments, anger, violence, and peace building, and sickness, aging, and death. Based on these discussions about the suffering condition of humanity today, the decision was made to hold a third Gethsemani encounter on the global ecological crisis and how monastic communities can be models for addressing this crisis. I was mentioning before we came up here that at the second encounter, it was on suffering, human suffering, and transforming that suffering. The question arises at the end, well, what is the most serious problem of suffering of not just human beings, of the earth, of our planet today, of all living beings? And that's the ecological crisis. And how can that be transformed? Well, obviously people need to think differently if they're going to behave differently. It's the sort of one of the monastic foundations. So that's why we chose this particular crisis. Monastic East and West felt that the overarching crisis facing humanity was ecological, and so the most recent encounter was held in 2008 and produced the volume Green Monasticism. What we find in this book, as in the encounter itself, is a dialogical approach to developing mutual understanding and support between Buddhist and Catholic monastic communities trying to address the ecological crisis through ecologically sustainable and responsible lifestyles. So it's an interfaith approach to the issue. In what follows here, I've tried to present an overview of the dialogue as recorded in the Green Monasticism. So first, mutual understanding through interreligious dialogue. In his article, The Wild Places, Thomas Merton gives his final words on the topic of modern technology and ecology. He points out a contradiction within our affluent culture with its unsurpassed power and control over nature. That is, as our civilization grows through the rational and conscious control and use of nature, we actually diminish at the same time and barbarize not only the environment but also ourselves. That is, in ruining the environment or affecting negatively the environment, we diminish the spiritual and moral qualities of our human identity, like humility, generosity, gratitude, charity, caring, and simplicity, in what is termed by one person a senseless idolatry of production and consumption for their own sakes. In the margin of his notebook for A Wild Place, The Wild Places, Merton says that the dreadful fact is that I was born into the world at the very moment when this whole thing came to a head. Civilization has undergone this massive attack from within itself. It presses on the brain with near darkness. It was certainly true that both Buddhist and Catholic monastics are very well aware of our dreadful ecological crisis today, and that it has a source from within our own civilization that is pressing us with a near darkness. I believe that monastics are perhaps more deeply aware of this crisis than the general population due to the fact that they've had a kind of monastic separation or distance from our present civilization and culture. In light of this distance, monastics today are contemplating, analyzing, and responding to the situation. For example, Buddhist monastics point out that, following sort of a Buddhist psychology, our senses provide us contact with the world around us. The contacts we have are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The pleasant sensation causes us to crave for more. Unpleasant sensation causes us to seek escape. These desires then become projects, plans for actions, and require making decisions and choices. In this whole process, we come to think of ourselves as independent from others and from the world, and thereby come to think of others and the world as things to be used for our projects, with the goal of making our life more pleasant. With this orientation to the world around us, nature becomes a resource for commodities that bring satisfaction and happiness through our senses. Through greater and greater resource extraction, commodity production, we eventually produce ecological damage, given that we're not, in fact, independent from our environment. And the things that, since all things are interdependent, this ecological damage eventually harms us as well. In Merton's words, we generate this massive attack upon nature and ourselves from within our technological and consumerist civilization. Catholics and monastics agreed with what the Buddhists had to say about this sort of internal psychological process that leads to ecological damage. They add that for Christians, the step in this causal chain where persons affirm their own independence from the interrelatedness of life is also a separation from God. It is a rejection of God's design on creation. That's a good point. The world in each moment displays an interdependence that is itself dependent on God's ongoing creative love. This love generates what one Catholic monastic calls the fellowship of creation, of which we're all a part. We all share a kinship with brother sun, sister moon, to quote Francis of Assisi, and to reject and isolate oneself from this fellowship within God's love is then, in fact, to sin, to fall short of who we really are and how we should live in that deep fellowship of the cosmos. This is not something I think we as Catholics think much about. Think about sin. Okay, what does one do about this? Turning to the monastic texts and ideals to gain some understanding on this, they realized, both the Buddhists and Catholic monks realized that Benedict, the founder of monasticism, didn't really have anything to say about it, nor did the Buddha, because this wasn't an issue back when they lived, okay? They didn't face this during their lifetime. On the other hand, there are some rules that indicate what the Buddha or Benedict might have said about this crisis today. During the Gethsemane encounter, 2 rules were mentioned in this regard. One is Dogen's instructions to the chief cook. and the other is Benedict's admonitions to the cellarer. So let's look at Dogen. Dogen says that the monastic cook must not be judgmental about the food he or she prepares. One must not see simple soup as inferior to rich soup as good quality. Both are expressions of the Buddha land. Therefore, one should cook all kinds of food with gratitude. Each vegetable should be treated with reverence, as one would treat the luminous objects of the Buddha land. Dogen said that the cook must love each measure of water, each grain of rice, as parents love their children with care and respect. In both preparing and serving food, the cook must maintain an attitude of service to others. Given these rules, it's clear by extension, the relationship one should have here with all living beings, with all elements of the environment, should be one of gratitude, humility, love, reverence, generosity, care, and service. Similar qualities of the heart lived in relation to objects are found in St. Benedict's rule for the cellarer. Benedict says that he is the abbot over things, thus implying that he should take the place of Christ in dealing with the things of the community, as the abbot has the place of Christ in dealing with the monastics themselves. What is the Christ-like way of dealing with things? First, things are to be given according to need. Those who need less should consume less in order to be generous to others. Those who need more should receive more with humility. What is important is that each person receives what is essential without judgment and with grateful acceptance. Also, he says that each person who receives things in the community must keep what they have clean, treating everything with care. The implication here is that everything we receive in life is a gift and should be taken gratefully. We should care for what we receive, using everything for the needs of ourselves and for others. Here we also find the spiritual virtues of gratitude, humility, love, reverence, generosity, care, and service. At this point, one might ask, well, does Benedict see anything that's similar to Dogen's realization that the things themselves that we're dealing with in the environment, in the world we live in, and things that we manufacture, are all Buddha nature? In fact, he does note it was noted in the dialogue that Benedict made a scriptural citation to Zechariah 14:20-21. The pots shall be the libation bowls before the altar, and every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts. Here the prophet is speaking about an eschatological vision of the New Jerusalem, which Benedict saw as prefigured in the monasteries. So while for Zen monastics, the Buddha land is to be realized right here in this world, for Catholic monastics, the New Jerusalem is to be realized in the monastery by the monastics' treatment of each other and of things. In the Gethsemane Encounter dialogue, both Buddhists and Catholics agreed that in the monastic life, persons and communities can fall short of these ideals taught by their founders. In regard to living the rules that can be related to the environment, Buddhists noted that Buddhist monastics sometimes need to develop a greater eye for the interrelatedness of life and a greater compassion and sensitivity for it. Without these qualities, the Buddhist monastic can misunderstand equanimity to be indifference, giving up desire as an excuse for non-action, and contentment as complacency. Buddhist monastics, for their part, noted that monastics need to see more clearly everything in its God-given particularity is interconnected with everything else. That's a quote. So that one does not leave the world behind when one enters the monastery. You go into a Benedictine monastery, over the gate is a sign that says, English translation, God alone. And so they're not leaving the world behind, but they're taking the sufferings of the world into the monastery for caring contemplation and prayer and response. So this leads us then to monastic models for environmental responsibility. How is this being played out today in Buddhist and Catholic monasteries? For Buddhist monastics, the one word that reoccurs over and over in the dialogue is simplicity. To live simply is to uncover, to discover one's true self without all the complexities that we add onto ourselves in our consumer culture. In this mindful simplicity, the artificial distractions that blind us to the natural world and our relation to it are removed. This simplicity of monastic living in relation to nature has led Buddhist monastics to mindfully recycle, repair, and reuse what they own in order to be more environmentally responsible. Besides living simply, Buddhists also stress living harmlessly to our environment. They have a heart traps for mice and bats and snakes. Typically they're vegetarian. They have this tradition of rescuing animals that might otherwise be killed for food. They've always been seen as a refuge in the East and also now in the US for animals. And it's common for them to have provide animal sanctuaries. In order to protect the earth, some monasteries use solar power for electricity, geothermal thermal systems for heat. One of them uses an efficient wood-fired water heater. Never heard about this before, but learned something there. By making these green choices, Buddhist monasteries have become models for the lay people that they serve, and lay people that live in their vicinity. On the Catholic side, we find something similar. Although one thing that's different that's interesting is that many Catholic monasteries find themselves in a position where they need to dismantle old and large buildings that are inefficient and, given their smaller communities, are really not so useful today. In this dismantling, some parts of the buildings are fashioned into art pieces, awnings, or other useful items. Unusable parts of the buildings are recycled for use as filler for building and reinforcing roads. And all unused metals are recycled for new construction. Acreage in monasteries that have been unused or leased for income and no longer need to be leased are being turned into planted with natural native grasses and wildflowers to provide sanctuaries for animals. They also use wind turbines. Sometimes some of them use wind turbines to supply their power. One has completed a green dormitory with solar hot water, heat assist, heat recovery, ventilation, other green features. Another is invested in geothermal heating as well as cooling with pond loops in a 5-acre pond that also includes water runoff, drainage, and a habitat for fish and fowl. As with the Buddhist monasteries, their choices have provided models for Catholic laypersons. Conclusion. Finally, what can we conclude from this interreligious dialogical approach to addressing the ecological crisis we're facing today? First, modernity has created a technological social reality that sees the earth and its creatures as resources for human comfort and enjoyment. Monasticism, on the other hand, has remained close to the earth for thousands of years, giving it a unique vantage point from which to view our modern culture. From that vantage point, monastics are able to identify the dynamics of human greed, attachment, self-enclosure, self-delusion that field the ecological crisis we face today, especially self-delusion. Read the newspapers, people's attitudes about global warming. Monastics see that our incredible development of technological skills, joined to the subtle yet powerful negative motivations of the human heart, leads to a loss of true wisdom about the interconnectedness of nature and the virtues associated with that interconnectedness that insight and sensitivity brings. Buddhists may see this matrix of life as the body of truth, or the body of the Buddha, and Christians may see it as a fellowship of all beings in God. But in dialogue, Buddhists and Catholic monastics present us, in the words of my co-editor, William Scudlard, with the prophetic call, quote, for both loving care and selfless non-attachment for the good of the cosmos as basic to solving our ecological problems today. In response to their own call, monasteries are becoming guide communities for other persons in search for what has been, in the words of Thomas Merton, a diminished and barbarized condition in our modern culture. They guide us all towards 1, a sensitivity to the unity woven through all of creation, 2, a loving kindness, compassion, and joyful affirmation for all living beings, for all existing beings, in light of that spiritual sensitivity, and 3, our true identity in fellowship with what is most sacred and all that the sacred contains. So, thank you very much.
I'm going to get the do we have a tech person in the house? I'll find it. I can get this part of it going, but I think we need to unblack the screen, so maybe Scott will. Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks. Can folks hear me okay? It's a real pleasure for me. I'm Liam Heneghan in the Environmental Science Program to share the stage with, the podium with Don, whose paper we just heard, and it was really superb. And of course with old friends David Wellman and Scott Kelley. Like maybe most Irishmen born in the mid-1960s, I was fated to become either a monk or a hippie. You can see which way that worked out, particularly in as much as, I've pretty much committed most of my life to kind of environmental thought, but also as an Irishman from that land of saints and scholars, as we say. Of course, most of my life has been heavily influenced not only by kind of a Catholic tradition, but also very directly by monastic thinking. I come from a small town called Temple Oak, which is Chocmalog, Oscuelga, which is the church of the little church of Mel, which was the monastery from the Middle Ages that was there. So I'm going to respond primarily kind of by doing a retrospective, a sort of a prequel, if you like, just very briefly reminding us of the magnitude of the environmental crisis. Since I'm an overly loquacious man and want to get off the podium as quickly as possible, just let me cut through to a kind of a punchline here. I think one of the issues that we might like to consider here is whether this sort of thinking, this sort of reconsideration of environmental thought that's going on amongst monastic communities, amongst monastics, whether its relevance is primarily for the way they conduct their affairs, or whether it has sort of relevance at a time where we need to very broadly reconsider a lot of our environmental thinking. So I guess I'm inclined, at least as an experiment, to sort of consider the latter. Two quick saints, two monastic saints, Columkill, very typical maybe of early Irish ascetic who leaves Ireland as part of his sort of ascetic calling to, and doesn't stop, takes his monks with him and doesn't stop until he gets as far away from Ireland as possible. So he sort of turns his back on the country. In fact, doesn't stop till he gets to Iona, and the tallest point in Iona, which is off the coast of Scotland, you can see back to Ireland. So that's one branch. The other branch kind of, and these are just stories that kind of really intrigued me as a child. The other one is Saint Kevin on the right, Saint Kevin of, or Saint Cuivine of Glendalough, another monastic settlement. Kevin went there to be alone to practice a very fierce form of ascetic practice that included him praying up to his waist in the very cold waters that ran through the that small mountain place in Wicklow. In fact, there's a kind of a lovely story though, which I think is relevant here. In the chilly waters of the river in Glendalough, he's so cold that his frozen fingers drop his prayer book into the river, and an otter jumps in to get it for him and returns it to him. And ultimately, Kevin goes back to society, but he is sort of highly influenced, you know, as a solitary, as a monastic, and as an ascetic. The other thing that very quickly comes to mind, just a reminder that even in sort of modern day Ireland, we're still influenced by kind of a monastic tradition, even though vocations there, of course, have been on a decline. Even like when the a new abbot is announced, the first beings that get told about this event, of course, are the bees. You know, you tell things to the bees. The monks have always been great farmers and toolsmen, technologists of sort, and beekeeping has always been part of it. So on the one hand, there's sort of a strong ascetic condition, or sort of ascetic set of ideals, but there's always been this very concrete connection to the world, particularly the world of other beings of the environment. The last kind of little prefactory things to say in preface to what I really want to say, just something that comes to mind, this astonishing poem, if you don't know it, by Seamus Heaney. Heaney, like me, would have been, though not a monastic, would have been very influenced by the traditions that we're talking about here. This extraordinary poem, I'm just going to read it out because it is so cool. It's from Seeing Things in 1991. The annals say when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayer, inside the oratory a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind, so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails. And then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. "This man can't bear our life here and will drown," the abbot said, "unless we help him." So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvellous as he had known it. What a great last line. And I think one of the reasons why this poem really sticks with me is, again, sort of the reminder that even though the metaphysics of the monastery may not be one that all of those of us here who are more secular in our orientation we may not share metaphysics, but it's pretty clear that the monks, you know, don't see themselves as rooted in this marvelous, or at least the marvelous that they're in, the marvelous of the here and now and the earth, are ones that they have, strong commitments to. So with all of that said, this is the main prequel that I wanted to get to. It's sort of the reminder of the enormity of the crisis that we're facing. I like to claim that I was the last person in Europe to do a PhD on acid rain, and I bring it up primarily because acid rain is a term that would have been very familiar during the kind of earlier Gethsemane dialogues. It's one of those terms that is used a lot less now. In fact, to entertain myself, I looked at the number of titles of papers with the term acid rain over the last number of decades, and you can see it's in a sort of a steady decline. I should have done this before I finished my PhD, and I might have gotten a job faster. It seemed like the term is no longer being used, and to a large extent that is sort of a credit to our environmental policy and our environmental thinking, in as much as the sulfur component of it, which has always been a strong component, we regulate pretty well. Environmental thinking and policy have been effective to some extent in curing the exportation of sulfur back into the atmosphere, which is a component of acid rain. But the other component of it, the nitrogen component, the putting of nitrogenous waste, NOx's, up into the atmosphere, which then can sort of spill back down upon us, often in an acidic form. That much has not been as successfully cured, and in fact, it's not a lovely term, it's not a delightful term, but I call this the great urination event, the way in which we have so poorly regulated our nitrogenous affairs that it is drizzling down on top of us still. And just to give you a sort of a sense, really I'm just saying this to remind us that even problems that we think have gone away are still around with us. We still have this sort of environmental crisis. Just a little factum here which you may find delightful. The amount of nitrogen that we fix, that we take out of the atmosphere because it really doesn't want to come out of the atmosphere, the amount of nitrogen that we take out of the atmosphere when all things are considered is pretty much the amount that nature is able to do. So we've doubled the amount of nitrogen getting into our global ecosystems, and this has some profound consequences that I could talk about more. I've actually been talking about it for 25 years, so I satisfy myself with just like two seconds more. One of the things, maybe one way of putting this, is that 1 to 2% of the world's energy currently goes to fixing nitrogen, which is a lot of energy. So this problem that has become a little bit hidden, in fact, sort of connects very strongly with that larger problem that we're all talking about at the moment, climate change. So we burn a lot of fossil fuels, a lot of natural gas, a lot of coal, etc., to put nitrogen into the soil, which ultimately gets back out again and drizzles down upon us. It connects with all of the other kind of major issues of global change. We manipulate nitrogen cycles by transferring nitrogen-fixing plants. For instance, Hawaii is devastated through the introduction of plants like this Faya tree and the like. Basically, what I'm saying here is that we do have, and we continue to have, despite our best efforts, an enormous environmental problem. Part of the problem, of course, it's sort of part of the delightfulness of living in this universe, is that everything is sort of connected to everything else. And this is what Tim Morton, in a book last year, is called the ecological thought. You know, all of these problems are connected. You know, over the last year or so, I have been kind of working on this book. It's a little bit polemical maybe, but the idea is that, you know, currently my understanding is that we don't have a set of environmental thoughts commensurate with the size of the problem. I have a long list of these things that I think, I'm not saying we're not doing great things, and I'm not saying that we're not making good progress, but we do not have a set of ideas that are commensurate with the size of the problem. I'm not going to go through all of these principles and then things wrong. I would say that basically the problem is, to put it in the words of that great environmental scientist, not Monk, Woody Allen, nature and I are two, and it's the extent to which that is both simultaneously true and not true that is probably our problem. I could say more about that if anyone was interested. So, you know, I've been, interested sort of for a long time, but more pronouncedly over the last couple of weeks since thinking about this paper, about the degree to which the thoughts of monastics and ascetics can be helpful here. In some ways they share a lot of the kind of sort of troubling aspects that environmental thought does, in as much as it tends to be anti-urban. It is trying to get away as much as possible from the dark stuff that we have created around us. The monastic tradition has very often been about getting out of town, and we know that the environmental tradition has too. I find a particularly useful resource, my family, other than me, are Greek Orthodox, so the Philokalia, that collection of the sayings of the Desert Fathers is pretty important in the Greek tradition, and it's pretty good. It's sort of a good resource for thinking this through. So, but I would ask the thought. I mean, this is a very sort of quick, compressed version of things that we might want to say in conversation. That what more do we have to do, and what more is it that monks are doing, and ultimately whether that we can ask the question whether what's going on in the monasteries can be helpful if we need to repair the broader contours of what is deficient in environmental thinking. I think this is really great. This is from Merton's very short book of the Wisdom, the Saying of the Desert Fathers. Just going to read it out. Abbot Lot came to Abbot Joseph and said, "Father, according as I am able, I keep my rule, my little fast, my prayer, meditation, and contemplative silence," so a good ascetic. "And according as I'm able, I strive to cleanse my heart of thoughts, of presumably troubling thoughts. What more should I do?" The elder rose up in reply and stretched out his hands to heaven, and his fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. He said, why not be totally changed into fire? And I think that's the question. Why not be totally changed into fire? How do we really kind of end up sort of addressing some of the problems that we, that we're confronting with sort of our environmental dilemmas? One of the things I think that comes very strongly through Don's presentations and through the work of the essays in Green Monasticism is this thought that, monasticism has been outside of the fray of modernity. It's an old tradition that is to some extent kind of a critique of modernity from the outside. And I think that can be pretty important. There's a lot of things to be said here, but just let me say this, that there has been sort of a contemporary critique of environmental thought, that it is sort of, its genesis is with romantic thinking, and romantic thinking is a species, an early species of modern thinking. And one of the faults is, or at least one of the peculiarities, of course, is that romantic thinking is also the thinking that leads to consumerist thinking. So it's not a good syllogism, and I think it needs a lot of unpacking, but the argument would be that ultimately one of the problems with environmental thought at the moment is that it's so deeply embedded in the consumerist aspect of of modernity, that it may not be as useful as we think that it's going to be. So witness, for instance, the way in which we, at the end of Al Gore's movie, we are invited to do things, which ends up basically being a shopping list of things that we need to swap out and new things that we need to buy, etc., etc. It's a bit of a caricature, but I think it's maybe worth thinking. I'm going to end with just a couple of questions. There's a lot other ones to ask. Both environmental thinking and monasticism are species of aesthetic thinking, so I think they share some kind of interesting roots. Will a renewal of thought in both areas result in a greater contribution from a renaissance in one to the other? And I think that's going to be kind of an interesting thing certainly for me to consider. When monastics reconsider, as they're doing, their responsibilities to the environment, are they mainly concerned about transforming their monastic life and the monasteries, or ultimately is the suggestion that this rethinking can do the sort of work that I think maybe it can be, that we should be thinking through whether that renaissance in amongst the monastics can be useful, beyond the confines of the monastery walls. Ultimately, I think we can ask, whether the ideas of kind of monastic environmental thinking, can we create a sort of a monastic secular tradition out of that might be useful for environmentalism? Thanks a lot. That's all I have for now. So I think we can reconvene.
Well, good afternoon. I'd like to say that it is an honor for me to be a part of this conversation, and I would like to thank Don for a very thought-provoking and welcome invitation to dialogue. Don's reflection on green monasticism was a wonderful opportunity for me to reflect on the burden and privilege of living in community, whether it is a monastic one, such as the Benedictines or the Tibetan Buddhists enjoy, or the multi-religious and multicultural one that is our university here at DePaul. As the paper we just heard calls attention to monastic models for addressing the global ecological crisis, I could not help but ask myself how green expressions of monasticism might creatively challenge those of us who live in a university setting to live more sustainably, materially, socially, and spiritually. Only a week ago, I had the privilege of spending a weekend with a Trappist community outside of Dubuque with a beloved colleague. And as you might imagine, I was thinking there about what I might say this afternoon. The community at New Melleray supports itself by making caskets, fashioned of wood harvested from forests, planted and maintained by the monks themselves. As a member of a family that has managed a sustainable tree farm for many years, I recognized in the monk's practice the same commitment to sustainability that has shaped my own family. Though the monks clearly deserve more credit, as making caskets is a meditation on the truth of earthly life that many of us lay folks tend to shy away from. As one who loves books, I did not miss the opportunity to visit the monastery's bookstore. And in the tradition of my people, the geeky book readers of the world, you know who you are, I bought a few books home with me. One of the books I bought was by the Benedictine Bennett Tvedten, and is entitled How to Be a Monastic Without Leaving Your Day Job. Brother Bennett's book is a reflection on the invitation to become an oblate and what it means to live outside a monastery's walls while still being very much aligned with those who live within them. Now it occurs to me, how many people here know what an oblate is? A few people. Okay, for those of you that didn't raise your hands, an oblate is somebody who has affiliated themselves with a particular monastic community, and they have taken vows to be a part of that community, but not within the walls as an actual monk, but as a person living in the world. And so this person who becomes an oblate is going to chant the Psalms, as monastic communities do, and they are going to strive to live simply and honorably in a way that reflects the ideals of the monastic community with which they've affiliated. And I understand that you would go back on a regular basis, perhaps every month, to meet a chapter meeting, to meet with the community that you have affiliated yourself with. But you're charged with going out into the world and, as the title of the book says, keeping your day job, but in fact reflecting the life of a monastic person in the world. As I've been reflecting on what I might say today in light of Don's paper, this idea of being an oblate has been sitting quite well with me, as I believe that the notion of being an oblate is a wonderful invitation to reflect on how one might build concrete bridges between the privileges and burdens of monastic life and the requirements of living in what some insist on calling the secular world. Put in these terms, the Buddhist-Catholic encounter that Don has described is a very useful invitation for me to consider the encounters I am invited into daily as a member of the community of DePaul University. This is because we who live and work at DePaul in the city of Chicago live in a very religiously diverse context, one that struggles imperfectly to define, build, and promote ecological sustainability. The man who I will refer to for the sake of our conversation as our abbot here at DePaul, Father Dennis Holschneider, though not a Benedictine, draws his inspiration from what I believe to be an equally compelling community, who are inspired by the lived-out faith of a 17th century French man and a French woman named Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. Perhaps you've heard of them. Like the monks Don describes, Vincent and Louise built many bridges and contact points through their work. Together they inspired many among the French nobility to open their eyes and to see for the first time that there were in fact poor people right in front of them, and that the duty of people of faith and means is to use one's resources to transform the lives of the marginalized for the better. In this respect, I would argue that Vincent and Louise were advocates of ecological sustainability, for they recognized that the material well-being of people was directly connected to their spiritual well-being. This truth is central to what I believe to be the heart of the most cutting-edge discourses on ecological sustainability, which reject any separation between issues of justice regarding the human and non-human worlds. For to separate such issues is to engage in what the Lutheran ecologian, Larry Rasmussen, calls apartheid thinking. Such thinking, Rasmussen says, fails to serve us when we so clearly are compelled to now to engage in complex, evolving, and integrated relationships which exist between human communities and the ecosystems we live within and depend upon. To live outside the walls of the admittedly religious monocultures that are monasteries is to be compelled to define community in pluralistic ways. This, of course, is not to deny the extraordinary and transformative gift of the monastics, whose discipline, at its best, allows its practitioners to see what so many of us are too distracted to notice. The first task of sustainable community builders, it would seem, is thus to see what we have in common. This is one of the many gifts the Christian and Buddhist monks we have just heard from are offering us. Yet seeing the commonalities, according to the scholar of religion Stephen Prothero, is only the beginning of what we now must do. Prothero describes the first stage of building bridges across religious traditions as Interfaith 1.0. Interfaith 1.0, he says, allows us to see that many of the core claims of our sacred texts, teachings, and practices are in fact beautifully congruent. In the same light, we can simultaneously see that in fact we all need many of the same things: clean water, breathable air, and arable soil. In this sense, it is the language of creation that not only binds us together, but in fact the very material requirements of the survival of the ecosphere and its inhabitants compel us to a certain degree of cooperation. For in the absence of a minimum of cooperation, we will do something else together. We will die. What are the requirements of real sustainability? It strikes me that one requirement is a profound and sustained commitment to risk-taking and boundary breaking, activities that are undergirded through cultivating a willingness to go far outside of our respective comfort zones. And this requirement is not just about what we must do materially. In fact, in the name of sustainability, I believe that we are called to be in community with those who many of us, without critical reflection, have been taught to call other. Here at DePaul, we have endeavored, though certainly far from perfectly, to see beyond many of the distinctions that the greater world would have us use to justify divisions among us. As such, we are a Catholic university that strives to concretely honor Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and other Christians with whom we live, work, and study. We are also a Catholic university with a queer studies program, much to the disappointment of some, I'll be honest, many, who claim that such a commitment is not in keeping with the core teachings of the Catholic tradition. I, for one, believe that the risks our community has taken in the name of inclusivity have served to make us green in many ways that we might not have previously imagined possible. And in becoming green in this way, I'm convinced that we have deepened our commitment to our own Catholic identity. The Vincentian question, which was first posed by Vincent's aristocratic patron, Madame de Gondi, asks, what must be done? Madame de Gondi asked this question when she realized that the peasants who worked on her family's land had not been honorably served by her family, her church, or her country. Their spiritual and material needs had not been met, and as a result, those whose ties to the land were the most intimate and vital had been denied the connection they needed to their spiritual tradition. In turn, these same people were also being denied the basic material requirements that guarantee physical health and well-being. Here at DePaul, our attempt to reflect what the lives of Vincent and Louise teach us is embodied in our service learning programs, where our students are invited to work in a variety of communities in need, and to subsequently reflect on what they have learned their experiences with the texts found in the syllabi of their classes. Among the many positive outcomes of this program has been one of interfaith bridge building through the cultivation of a common identity, resulting in many of our students, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Catholics, and Protestants, choosing to identify themselves as Vincentians. I submit that in this sense, these students have in fact become oblates of a new Vincentian order, one committed to a dynamic religious and ecological inclusivity. It is within the work of this new order that service and learning, rooted in the Catholic tradition, become even more transformative and profoundly inspiring than their original advocates could scarcely have imagined. But as positive as this is, we still have a long, long way to go. For now, our circumstances require that we move from what Stephen Prothero calls Interfaith 1.0, where we celebrate and build community based on what we have in common, to Interfaith 2.0, where we soberly acknowledge all the things that make us different. and on which we passionately disagree. And then, in spite of all these differences, we build community anyway. It is through this interfaith 2.0 level of work that I believe we're being called to name and embrace our shadow side. It is here that we must look and not turn away from who we are and the choices that we have made to undermine sustainability and the subsequent damage that we have caused ourselves and others. This is where a practice not entirely unlike the sacrament of reconciliation must become a cornerstone of living that is interpreted in a way that can be practiced across traditions, in ways that are meaningful and transformative for everyone. It is here that we must creatively strive to find ways that we can become one another's confessors across the boundaries of religious difference, as together we redefine what it means to be of service to others and to the integrity of the greater biosphere. This is where the Vincentian question that Madame de Gondi asked, what must be done, becomes what must be done together. It is said that good fences make good neighbors, but I believe that the walls that we have previously seen as separating the monastic from the rest of us must now become a means of connecting the contemplative life with the life of the greater lay communities. I submit that we must make these connections in the name of building ecological sustainability. We all greatly benefit from being given the space to become more contemplative, and in turn the spiritual strength that is derived from a contemplative practice must now be channeled into the practice of risk-taking. This makes logical sense in that risk-taking appears to be one of the very hallmarks, the key hallmarks of the founders of all the great global religions, be they Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad, or the Buddha. My students fashion a marvelous name for what I believe we are being invited into. They call it creative discomfort. They describe creative discomfort as when we willingly enter into a space that challenges our assumptions and our estimation of ourselves and others. It is in this space that we must resist our profound desire to flee. And rather than fleeing, we must instead submit to the call to intentionally linger, and then very purposefully lean in to exactly what it is that we fear. There are many among the followers and leaders of every religious tradition who teach that we are not supposed to be doing this work. They tell us that our comfort, our earthly survival, and even our relationship with the divine are contingent on uncritically following the people and ideas that affirm the status quo, and serve to define what such folks determine to be true sacred community. But I believe that the story of community building practices of the Catholic and Buddhist monks that Don has shared with us is an invitation to a new way of envisioning the work of building sacred community. It is now to us to interpret and to put into practice in our own contexts this same commitment to crossing boundaries of difference, and, in the name of this work, of healing. For just as the sustainability and resilience of an ecosystem is contingent upon an integrated, evolved, and dynamic diversity, so too are our efforts at building ecologically, socially, and spiritually sustainable human communities. Thank you.
We have some time for questions and answers, so I just ask that you raise your hand and I'll hand you the microphone. We're trying to capture these questions and responses.
First, I want to thank you guys for a very compelling and very relevant topic. A lot of really cool things for me to think about after the fact. But I think a thread that ran through what all three of you said were these sort of two aspects of green monasticism. The ideology and the humility, the respect for the earth, for the care and all that. And so that ideology, but also the techniques and the things that you would do, whether it's solar energy, whether environments, where you gain your power, the way that you treat the earth, what have you. And so, what I would be curious what you all think is in looking at moving these green monastic techniques and things outside of the monasteries into the quote-unquote secular world. Which is more important, the kind of getting people behind the ideology and the care of the earth, or implementing the green programs and then having the ideology follow? So which of those is more important, and which do you think is more likely to take hold? Because obviously, you would hope that that people would gain this sort of respect for the earth, and then the techniques to take care of the earth better would follow. But with the green movement being as pop culture oriented and as popular as it is right now, would that be a better means of grabbing people and really making a difference? Or should we really start in people's minds before we go to building windmills everywhere?
Well, I could take a stab at answering your question. The focus that the monastics at the Gethsemane all three Gethsemane encounters emphasized was the inner transformation of people's ways of understanding themselves, the world around them, and the relation between those two. And I think it's part of it is that there's a feeling that if one just says, okay, let's focus on new technologies and embracing new technology, developing new technologies and so forth, that, as Liam was saying, in some ways it almost leads to a consumerist attitude, you know, well, I'm going to buy the newest kind of light bulb or whatever it might be. And so their stress has been on, you know, what can we as monastics, given our contemplative experience of God and the universe, or Buddha and the universe, what can we offer to people in terms of helping to change what they see as a deep sense of alienation and delusion about who we really are and what this life is really about, caused by the dynamics of the society in which we live. So that's I think that's of the two that you offered, that's their emphasis. And in terms of what they're doing in the monastery themselves, they are trying to introduce, you know, new sustainable ways of living, and also farming and the other things that they do. So they see that as important, because in some ways the things that the monasteries have always had an outreach to the local community around them. And so if you go to a monastery, there's always somebody there that meets with individuals from the community that are in need of money or something, you know, and so they're sort of caring for the people around them. So they're aware that it's through the introduction of these new technologies that people outside, at least, it catches their attention, as you said. But for them, the real focus is to help them through these oblate programs or whatever it might be, to change the way in which they understand themselves in the world.
I'll just say with very sort of brief code. So, I mean, it's kind of easy, of course, to say it's got to be some sort of a mashup, you know. But in reality, of course, you know, we've got to prioritize. We've got to decide, okay, there's a kind of significant problems, and we need to have kind of a sort of a program. I guess so. You know, using that as a way of sort of pressing one towards a decision. I mean, I think we do have a crisis. I'd call it a crisis of subjectivity. I see other people just talking about it as a crisis in thinking. So you know, where that doesn't, if one says that one really needs to think about kind of this conception of what it is that we are as people, you know, and what our relationship is, you know, or ought to be, what the relationship ought to be with the rest of the natural world I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't start thinking about sort of relevant technologies and the like, but I think we should be thinking sort of long and hard and sort of about the way in which we should be doing this job of conceiving ourselves. Just to give you a kind of, because that's all kind of a little wishy-washy, just very pragmatically, I mean, when you think about like the history of environmental thinking over the last, I don't know, let's go back 150 years or so, pretty much you can go through the literature of the environment, particularly ecology, without having seen the word urban in that literature. Tiny bit of exaggeration, but it's pretty true that we don't have a systematic exploration of what it is to be a city dweller until relatively recently. What is an ecology of the city? We were so sort of all infatuated with sort of wildernesses and national parks. It doesn't mean that you get rid of these, but you start thinking a little bit about what it is to be human in this urban context. Now that's not an idea, of course, that we get from the monastics, but I think I'm using that to illustrate that it has been pretty easy for for environmental thought to go down a particular rabbit hole and not really think about what are the other resources for thought. And I think that's what the invitation is, as far as it's an invitation to see what, what other ways in which we can conceive ourselves that might be helpful in sort of addressing some of these problems.
Well, I think that in light of what Liam said, that I've really got to go with the mashup answer to your question. I think that in many ways, so many people are different. So some people will be drawn to action immediately and will need to do things with their hands. Other people will need time to reflect. I think that regardless of which path one takes, I think it's quite clear to me that in order to live sustainably in the long term, we're going to have to engage in some huge changes, not only in our behavior, but also in the way that we imagine ourselves in the world and our connection to it. And I think that that is going to require a tremendous amount of spiritual strength, because people are going to be asked to do things that are scary. That doesn't mean that, I know that if we watch the Al Gore film, for example, I mean, a lot of our responses might be that this is, mind-numbingly depressing, and I don't want to think about this, I want to flee. But at the same time, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what will give us the courage to engage in this creative discomfort that my students described, and to stand and remain standing in a place where we are availing ourselves of the opportunity to hear what it is that we need to do. So I think that people are going to work toward more sustainability on a number of different levels simultaneously. I mean, in some cases we will be forced to. If gas, for example, in the United States goes to the price the average European pays, which would be about $9 a gallon, I think some people will have to abandon the cars they drive now and walk. And then they'll have a time to reflect. Now, all of us here who have the privilege of being a part of a university community, I mean, I'll call us all privileged based on the fact that we get to sit in this room together. We have the opportunity to engage in a certain degree of reflection, to gird ourselves for the work that we need to do. Many other people in the world don't have the luxury of reflection and are forced to act because they're living in a war zone. They have to find enough wood to build a fire to purify the water that they have to drink. And so for them, reflection might take place after a day of very hard work. So I think one of the things that we can all do, though, is to ask ourselves, how can we identify the communities, plural, that we are already very vitally connected to, and what is our part to contribute to the sustainability of those communities?
I should add a little quick comment. I wrote this paper at Purdue, which is a rural area of the country, and I forgot, oh yeah, DePaul, it's an urban campus, right? And if I thought a little bit more about that and the issues that your university is addressing here in the city, I would have mentioned that one of the things that came up in the dialogue was something new in monasticism, and it's called urban monastics. And this is a small movement, but one example is where you would have 2 or 3 nuns, monastic women, who would be moving into a urban environment where things are not in good condition. The environment is quite broken down. And in some ways define the community in terms of the blocks around where they live and such, and begin to be a resource for funneling not just spirituality, but also practical changes within that community. And so it's in some ways it's a step beyond, not beyond, but something that augments the oblates, where you actually have the vowed monastics going and living in a kind of inner city monastic community and trying to work within the community. And in some ways that breaks down our distinction between contemplative and active, right? You have active orders that are in the city, and you have contemplatives out in the countryside or something. And so they're starting to move in that direction as well.
A comment, a question, then a comment. The comment, Liam, you said that with acid rain, that's something that we all find hopeful, because we say there was a time when actually people came together and looked at the evidence, and actually were able to have an impact on the environmental issue. My question is, why haven't we been able to absorb the data that is just pouring over us every day about the incredible deterioration of our resources, whatever area you want to look at? People now, we call it global warming or whatever, about climate change. The rhetoric, we're focusing on that versus water. And specifically, UN's going to have Rio 2012. And the basis of it's going to be to look at what did they talk about 20 years ago versus today. So my question for the three of you is what is there, if you did the modeling, and you said we don't have ideas commensurate with the problem, the data is there. And so we keep thinking, why can't they make the connection? My final comment is that the monastics, what got me interested in them is that as a student of economics, when I read the figure that their height in the Middle Ages, you probably know what time that would be, but they controlled like 30 to 40% of the gross national product of the countries in Europe. They were enormously successful, and very successful from a sustainability standpoint. So I do look to say, did they see something that made these connections that we're missing today with so much evidence coming at us?
I might just start with a little piece of it. And it's, like the last question, it's a question of like great enormity. So we could spend quite a bit of time on it. Just a couple of things. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons I'm mentioning acid rain is that there is, of course, has been some successful policy kind of approaches to the sulfur component of it, but I'm just maybe reminding us that a lot of the problems, maybe even ozone as well, I mean, things that we sort of set aside and say, okay, well, that's solved, but they still have very real manifestations at the moment. So on the one hand, I'm saying that it's not that we are going to abandon kind of all of the good work, including data collection, all of the good policy connecting that data with kind of action in the world. That's not to be abandoned. I'm just saying that we probably, there's also part of us that need to be stepping back and doing kind of a critique of our thinking in order to supplement it. But the big question there is, like, we have the data in on a lot of these issues. Why aren't we responding in an appropriate way? And that, of course, itself is a mind-boggling question. It's a huge phenomenon. To some extent, of course, environmental thought has had like a kind of a professional relationship with predictions of disaster, and sometimes maybe that just doesn't rhetorically work out very well for us. Just to give like a little illustration of that, because I think it's entertaining, if nothing else. During the BP spill that we all witnessed at the beginning of last summer, I think a lot of environmental folks thought that, okay, well, people really get now what the issues are in terms of, resources and in terms of the potential for fouling really critical resources. One of my colleagues, though, said her response to it was, I had just no idea that there was so much oil down there. So what should in fact have been kind of this moment of awakening that we think people will eventually get when it comes to some of the things that we do, in fact very often has very unpredictable kind of outcomes. So I think it's an open question. There's a lot more to be said about it, but I think it's certainly an interesting question. And I think that's the part I'll address. There's other things.
Well, one way I think that we can start to work to make the connections is we need to, particularly here in North America, we need to problematize the propensity on our part to make this a conversation among white privileged people. So here we are, three white guys up at this table talking about this, and we can speak in abstract terms about a material sustainability, but there are many people in other parts of the world for whom the topic of ecological sustainability is a very vital and central part of their lives. I mean, even in our own country, people will talk, for example, about the phenomenon of ecological racism, which is to talk about the idea that the vast majority of toxic waste dumps in this country are in neighborhoods of people of color. And these dumps have radically changed the quality of life. The instance of asthma, for example, among young children in these communities. And so it's less about an abstract idea of I'm going to talk about global warming or I'm going to talk about the ozone, or, and it's more to talking about the meat and potatoes realities of a lot of people. And if we start to talk about those, or, for example, the simple fact that all of us are part of the ecosystem. None of us were flown in from another planet. And I think sometimes we talk about these things as if there's a material reality about sustainability with which we have the option of either being in dialogue with or not, but in fact we're soaking in it, you see. I remember I was at a conference a few years ago where a number of people from small island states came to talk about how the levels of the sea were rising, and they were watching their homes disappear under the water. And there was one gentleman from Samoa, his name was Otofu, and he was talking about the island that he grew up on and places where he had played as a child now were under the water. And you know, it made me think I wanted to have a Michael Moore moment and invite this guy to come sit out in front of a Hummer dealership and talk with people about his island disappearing. And there was a direct connection between that and the choice of vehicle that you might be getting ready to buy. So I think we need to talk about these things in much more meat and potatoes ways. And at the same time, I think that there's a responsibility, speaking as a student of religion, I think there's a huge burden of responsibility on all people associated with all religious traditions to very concretely interrogate the degree to which that the way we've interpreted our creation narratives, the way we have talked about stewardship, has direct implications for how unsustainable the way we live really is. And that we've made choices, the way we want to talk about the value of the human being, or the human being being almost godlike, and therefore everything before us is something that we own. I think we need to start to unpack some of the ways that we've given ourselves permission over and over and over again to live unsustainably as if this was our right. And so I think that while we're doing this, of course, meanwhile, we're becoming more and more unsustainable. So I think we have to juggle this, you know, multiple sets of responsibilities, the material requirements that we need to step up and start changing now, but also at the same time, hopefully, we can all be multitaskers together, that we can also talk about the ways that we can problematize assumptions that we've made about what our rights are and what our responsibilities are.
Thank you very much for three splendid addresses. And my question touches the last speaker's comments, perhaps. I think all three of you mentioned the importance of an interior change of mind and heart in relation to these matters. To what extent is a shared understanding of creation, a doctrine, a theology of creation, vital in all of this? I think some of you implied that it's when we, in fact, no longer see the world as gift, no longer have an attitude of gratitude, but then we start using what's around us in a way that is more guided by personal interest and self-centeredness rather than generosity.
For the Buddhist, on the Buddhist side, looking at both sides of the dialogue, on the Buddhist side, I think it's easier to see that connection between the philosophy, let's say, of Buddhism and the teachings and the texts and so forth, and the natural environment in a manner that gives the kind of value to creation that would be important to have if one is going to take ecology seriously. One of the things that came out in the dialogue is that on the Christian side, that on a popular level, let's say, not so much perhaps a professional theological level, But on a popular level, the idea of creation as something apart from God, something ex nihilo, created ex nihilo, and that God has given humankind the responsibility for dominion over the created order, and has given humankind then the what's seen by many Christians, I think, as a kind of right to utilize basically the natural order for the benefit of humankind. Why? Because the humans have the image of God, and they're the ones that this created order is here for, and the created order is here in some way at the service of humankind's development in relationship to a transcendent God and such, and seeing God and the divine as somehow apart from this world. Now those are all different elements in sort of the popular Christian view of the world in which they live and their relationship to it. And what the contemplative order is saying is that in our contemplative life, we find this is not in fact the case, that there's God is present within the world, and we in the world in God, in a way that brings us a sense of family and gift, as you mentioned, or gives us the sense of family and gift in our relationship to the world, and that brings then a whole different attitude towards nature, towards the world. And I didn't mention that in my paper, but that was certainly one of the issues in the dialogue, that on the Christian side there is this perception of things coming from a particular reading of Genesis that is quite popular and quite influential in today's world.
We've just got a couple minutes left, and I want to get another question.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. I've been sitting here and wondering about the whole question of the language that we use to describe sustainability, and wondering what definition of sustainability we are working with. Because it seems to me that has been used and can be used in sometimes ways that are contradictory and confusing. One question. The other comment has to do with what you were saying about who is the we that you're talking about in the whole story of sustainability and ethics. I'm thinking of, for example, the conflict that sometimes appears to be there between conservationists, those who think about sustainability in terms of conserving nature and so forth, and the indigenous communities, for example, in Africa, who are accused of spoiling the environment, killing the animals, hunting and so forth, completely overlooking that the fact that some of these communities have some of the most sustainable ways of living with and supporting partnering nature, for example, of the Maasai and other indigenous communities.
It's such a, it's an immensely rich question. It's kind of a tough one to end with, because there's a lot to be said. Just very briefly, I think most of us in kind of the environmental science end of things, the definition of sustainability that we use is something along the lines of a level of resource use, kind of along with kind of a social arrangement and a commitment to kind of economics that's consistent with the longest possible use of the resources that we've got at the moment. And so to be clear, like, what sort of arrangements do we have to have in our affairs that allow us to bequeath to future generations that which we might want for ourselves? Now, there's a vagueness there, because there's a lot, some ways to get that may involve breaking everything down and rebuilding it, you know, just to be dramatic about it, or else could be construed as being sort of very soft and complicit. And I think that's been a lot of the trouble with the term. But I just love that question, and it's such an important one about sort of indigenous folks and their rights. I think this in some ways gets to the core of one of the difficulties that environmental thinking has had, that, you know, because of its, you know, existing kind of ideological framework, it's often permitted itself to make harsh declarations about the use of the world by the least privileged. Just to think a little bit about the population stuff, when we obsess about population, very often it means that it gets translated into policy suggestions that affect the bodies of the least enfranchised women on earth. I mean, it's sort of finger wagging by, you know, men that look like me to, you know, the some of the poorest people on earth. You know, the triaging of India. I mean, so we got to be able to rethink about that. That's why kind of the notion of economic justice has to be right at the core of sustainability thinking, in my view. And I think that is the view that we're pushing towards.
I have to say that I'm very attracted to the idea of always combining the term sustainable with the word community, and the idea of saying that the hermeneutic of sustainability must begin by examining what are the requirements for maintaining the material, social, and spiritual sustainability of a real community of people, and what are those requirements. In the past, I think the term sustainability has been divorced from human communities, and then we end up talking about just a material sustainability, and at a certain point that allowed a term like sustainable development to be translated into the equivalent of sustainable profitability for a company, rather than sort of losing the thread of what it meant originally. So I think that starting with the idea of a community and working outward as we connect it to other communities is at least one approach that I think is quite helpful.
Just get the last word in very quickly. I like what you just said, both of you, but especially this idea of connecting what we're talking about to community, to the way in which people interact within their communities, and through that with the universe. And in terms of my answer to the last question I was asked about sort of the theology that might be a good underpinning for this sense of community and nature as being part of a singular interrelated reality, I just want to give a plug for tonight's lecture by Maria Voce. She's going to be talking about Trinitarian vision of the world and spirituality, which exactly is what we're talking about here. And I think that's one of the most promising directions for changing the way people think about themselves in the world and nature by going back to a Trinitarian vision. So anyway, I think it'll be very interesting to see what she has to say about these things.
I wanted to thank you for joining us, and thank you to our three panels, Don, Lam, and David.